Okay, so we can hear you loud and clear, Noam, and we can see you very well. Can you see us and hear us as well?
Yeah, I can see you both.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great then. No hiccups.
Volume's high. Okay, let's try.
Okay, so firstly, Noam, thank you for taking the time to actually talk to us for an hour in such a time. I'd like to thank, on behalf of both myself and my girlfriend, this is a dream come true for us, of course, and we really don't want to trouble you with unnecessary stuff and get right down to questions after introducing ourselves, if it's okay.
Sure.
Of course. Would you like to start, honey?
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'm İrem. İrem. Does my microphone work? No?
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah? Okay.
Yes, it's working.
Okay.
Maybe if you can speak slower would be good.
Maybe I should.
Okay.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So it doesn't matter. My name is İrem, and I am pursuing my MA in Turkey at Hacettepe University in English Language Teaching Department, and I'm also working at Hacettepe University School of Foreign Languages as an instructor.
Okay.
No, my major was actually linguistics in the same university, Hacettepe University. And after studying linguistics, because of a mentor that had a lot of influence on me, I wanted to pursue translation and interpreting and look at language in that way, also practice translation and interpreting in my life as well, so that I can get a better grasp of it. I got interested in a lot of different topics over my time in the university, ranging from discourse analysis to maybe more micro areas of linguistics. But mostly I was interested in ideology, and also I was interested in lyrics. But on the side, I've always been interested in artificial intelligence and language systems that will work for the betterment of our future. So also in the translation and interpreting department right now, I am studying on automatic captioning systems for my master's thesis, which help a lot with videos, especially around this time. I think it will become very relevant. Other than that, I don't think there is anything critical. And if you would like to continue, we can go on with the questions.
Sure, let's go ahead.
All right. So have you had a chance to look at the questions up to now?
I did, but things go so fast, I've already forgotten what they were. So let's start.
Yeah, of course, of course. What we would like to do is... What is it?
I said you can't believe the intensity these days.
Of course, of course. I wouldn't even be able to imagine that around this time especially. But I see you very happy, healthy, and that is a thing to be happy for, I think, for us.
Good. So let's go ahead.
All right. So I think I can start with the first question. All right.
Yeah.
So our first question is a bit of a long question, but it actually has a very core kind of idea. What could be some of the projections you may make on the presumable future implications of artificial intelligence research and development, utilizing natural language processing and deep learning technologies for studying the phenomenon of language itself, the development of language-based utilities, and furthering studies on language acquisition, learning, and teaching?
Well, artificial intelligence up to this point has been basically an engineering approach. We use brute force to get the best results we can. So you can have, say, language acquisition. You can have a couple of supercomputers, maybe you'll get a quantum computer, which will look at, immense quantities of data, extract some patterns, and if it has, it'll have to start with initial instruction. Otherwise, it just gets noise, like an infant does. What an infant hears is noise. So, for example, if you were to talk Turkish, I would hear noise. I wouldn't know where the words are. I wouldn't know what the sounds are, anything. That's what's presented to a human and a human infant. And it very quickly learns the language. For AI, what's presented is pre-analyzed materials, even trained in various ways to identify them. But it can, with a certain amount of training and endless quantities of data and huge computing capacity, it can sometimes get somewhere near the normal knowledge of a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, which is in fact a lot of knowledge. That means virtually full knowledge of the language. For the study of language, it's meaningless. I mean, nothing remotely like that happens in the world. You can easily show that deep properties of language that aren't exhibited in the data are known by young children. To give some examples if we have time. So from the point of view of science, it's basically zero. But as an engineering approach, it can be quite effective. Like I use Google Translators. It's better than if I want to get the rough idea of a letter in Greek or something. I run it through the translator and I sort of get the point. But nevertheless, it's just simply brute force. So it's basically not telling you anything about the language. It's divorced from science. That's not a criticism, incidentally. Like I say, I'm happy to have the Google Translator, but we shouldn't confuse it with the effort to understand something about human intelligence, about the capacities of an infant that enables it to acquire incredible knowledge in a year or two. These are just different topics. Now, could artificial intelligence change to become part of the sciences? Yes, it could. And in fact, it's done by people who study it from a scientific point of view. They don't call it artificial intelligence. They call it constructing theoretical models of what you discover from empirical research, normal science, in other ways. In other words, I mean, a biologist doesn't call what they're doing. Suppose a biologist is studying, say, the coronavirus. They don't call what they're doing artificial intelligence. They call it science. You try to use your background knowledge of biology. You try ideas about what might work, experiment with them. They fail. You try something else. You could model that as in a computer program. Not much point, but you could, and maybe, and in fact, these engineering methods like deep learning are indeed used to try to look through masses of data to see if you can detect patterns that you wouldn't have noticed yourself. So that's an interaction, which is, the way science works generally. It's kind of like in older days, a biologist would be working on something and run into a block, and they go to the library and see if it's some book that tells you something. This way, what you do is run a deep learning program and see if it tells you something, which is fine. That's very useful and valuable. Could it go beyond that? In theory, it could. So there's a very smart physicist named Max Tegmark, very good physicist who works on AI and deep learning. And he's pointed out that in theory, it's very remote from reality now, you could imagine some immense supercomputer which looks through all successful cases of scientific theory construction, and it might find methods that are used of which the scientists themselves are unaware, just done intuitively, but could be detected from massive pattern extraction, which could indeed lead the system to discover something new. In theory, it's possible. We can lay out the possibilities, but it's very remote from anything within reach. Max Tegmark calls this the third level of intelligence, beyond human intelligence.
Thank you for that response. So in terms of this, actually, many of our questions are interrelated, so I will not ask much follow-up questions in terms of especially cognitive science and artificial intelligence related topics. But I would like to get your ideas on language, learning, teaching, and the difference between learning and acquisition. And is there a way this engineering approach can help us replicate the process of language acquisition by examining incredibly large amounts of data?
Well, I think examining large amount of data are probably not going to be helpful for the study of language acquisition. And there's a reason for that. By now, there are very good, careful statistical analyses of the actual data that's presented to a child of, say, age 2 or 3. It's not enormous by computer standards, millions of sentences. That's not a big number for a computer. But however, if you look at these sentences, the best work on this, if you want to look into it, is done by a very smart computer scientist, cognitive scientist named Charles Yang. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. So he's done a lot of statistical work on the data available to children. But he has also basically applied what's known as Zipf's law, famous observation. If you take basically any text, Benoit Mandelbrot, famous mathematician, the guy who invented fractals and worked on them, he worked on this back in the 1950s. And what he demonstrated is that if you take any text at all, say everything on Google, and you pick one symbol, say call it the letter T, and you call that word boundary, and you take, you call a word anything that appears between two successive T's, okay? You get a certain distribution of rank frequency. You get small words that occur very frequently, then it declines, and you get the longer words, they barely appear, and there's a fixed prediction as to the curve for rank frequency distribution. Now, if you look at actual language, spoken language, where the word boundary is space, you get the same distribution. And what that means is, as Yang points out, that the child is hearing some words many, many times, and most words is hearing maybe once. So essentially nothing. And I can't remember that it heard it 6 months ago, So basically, children, even just the meaning of words, which are pretty complicated when you look into them, they're basically acquiring on 1 or 2 presentations. And experimental work with children by Lila Gleitman and others has shown that that's in fact the case. If you study closely an invented word, that you give a meaning to, and you put it in a, you know, a video program in which the circumstances kind of give you a hint as to what the meaning is. Children learn it almost instantaneously. And so essentially what we know, and in fact, if you take the actual texts, the texts that Young studied, the actual texts, you don't get very many bigrams and very few trigrams. So if you do any of the normal kind of statistical analysis, you're going to end up with basically nothing because the data is simply too sparse. So that means that looking at large amounts of data is not going to tell you much. In fact, very much as if you were trying to study, say, the development of the visual system. We know from experiments with other animals, cats, monkeys, that who have essentially the same visual system as humans. If you experimentally manipulate very early experience, like by presenting a kitten with horizontal lines, but not vertical lines, or other kinds of manipulations, it's going to change radically the way the visual system develops. Now, we don't see that with humans because they're all exposed to pretty much the same visual environment. But we know from these experiments it could be wildly different with different experience, controlled experience in the early period of life. Well, turn to language. If you want to study the development of the visual system, there isn't any point taking massive videotapes of everything a kitten sees. It's not going to tell you much because it's all internally developed. It's genetically determined that you develop a certain kind of visual system. No amount of data is going to turn a human infant into an insect with an insect visual system. It's got to be a mammalian visual system. So it's built in. And then a small amount of data is necessary to kind of trigger it and shape it in a limited way. And you can get an appearance of diversity just by manipulating the early data. Now, in the case of language, you don't have to manipulate because the different languages, in fact, do give you different data. So you grew up with different data than I do, so we have different linguistic capacities. But it's fundamentally the same, just as the visual systems are fundamentally the same. The more we learn about language, the more we discover that the core system is pretty much universal, maybe totally universal, and that the apparent variation that comes from superficial variation in experience within actually a pretty narrow range, but it's diverse enough so that different people can't understand each other. Like there's dialects of English that are just gibberish to me, even though they're dialects of English and very different. And it's mostly in the sounds, the way the sounds are put together. And notice that the way the sounds are put together is not really part of language. It's part of the articulatory system, which has nothing to do with language. It was around hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years before language emerged. And it hasn't been modified for language. So you get the variation, apparent variation, mostly, maybe entirely, in the externalization of the internal system to one or another sensory motor medium. Could be sign, like sign language, which blind people pick up as virtually the same as spoken language.
Yes.
The course of acquisition is virtually the same. But of course they use space rather than sound. And you can even use touch much harder because we don't have that much control. You can't use smell because our systems aren't good enough. Maybe with a dog you could use smell. But the variation seems to be way out on the periphery and systems that are really not part of language. It's kind of as if you had a computer with a printer. The computer program's the same for different printers, there are different settings of the printer, but what comes out can look very different depending on how you set the printer. But that has nothing to do with the computer program inside. It stays the same. And language is kind of like that. The more we learn, there's a lot to learn, the more it seems to get to the point where even what look like wildly different languages have fundamentally the same principles, which are just built in. And we're beginning to understand something about what they might be. So if you want to study language acquisition, that's what you really have to look at. Yes. But studying massive amounts of data is going to be of very little help. I should say that it's by no means true that all linguists agree with this. In fact, most of them deny it. And most of them think children just learn by association or habit or something like that. But when you look closely, you see that can't possibly be true. Yang's work on the sparsity of data is one reason, but experimental work with children also shows that at a very early age, they know principles of language for which there's no evidence at all in the data. Yes. And you can show the same thing with vision. Like we see things a certain way, not because we're trained to. We see the moon illusion because that's the way we're built. It's not because we had a lot of experience with moons. No.
Yes.
Right.
I think that makes a lot of
I thought disagreeing.
Yes, of course, we agree too.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that we agree upon as well. In terms of just large quantities of data being able to prove sufficient for us to replicate human cognitive or linguistic faculties. And also, we believe that language has nothing to do, in essence, with speech or any kind of sound. And that's why İrem actually studies semiotics so that she can get a much wider kind of perspective on the way language works. So that makes a lot of things clear. And if you don't mind, we can continue with the questions because they also have a lot of relations with what you just said.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay. Would you like to ask the second one?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
And speak slowly because I don't hear too well.
Okay. So as Onur said, I'm studying semiotics. So the second question is related to semiotics, basically. So how relevant do you think semiotics and cognitive science may prove in relation to your projections on such a trifecta, artificial intelligence, natural language processing, deep learning, and could you give some examples for us, if you don't mind?
Well, semiotics has to do with much broader questions than the nature of language. It has to do with questions, first of all, of language use in particular circumstances and other symbolic systems. Actually, I once heard a lecture on semiotics by one of the leading figures in the field, Dan Sperber, who you may know. And he opened the lecture by saying, semiotics has two topics, language and traffic signals.
That is
kind of a joke, but what he's saying is there are other symbol systems, but they work their own ways. They're not going to tell us much about language. However, you try to find out what a sentence means. Pick a sentence. The study of language is not going to tell you. I'll tell you a lot. It'll tell you the basis of it, but what the sentence actually means depends on all kinds of background knowledge and experience that isn't encoded in language. So suppose I tell you I'm interested in the undecidability of the continuum hypothesis. The language isn't going to tell you what that means. a person who knows English perfectly, you know, the greatest professor of English in the world, isn't going to know what that sentence means. You have to have a lot of background knowledge about what the continuum hypothesis is, what undecidability means, doesn't mean what the normal use of the word tells you. You're going to have to understand a fair amount about modern mathematics. What does it mean for a mathematical hypothesis to be undecidable? You have to know Gödel's proofs and so on. In other words, you bring a vast amount of background knowledge to bear, even to understand what that short sentence means. And it's not very different in other cases. When I take my car to be fixed, and the guy who's fixing the car tells me what he did, I haven't the slightest idea what he's talking about. I never heard of. I mean, I understand the words, and I understand that the sentence is grammatical, but try to duplicate it, I know where to begin. And I think that's true for speech generally. So it's a mistake. There were efforts at one time in linguistics to try to build the whole meaning into the grammatical structure. It's called generative semantics, but it just collapsed under its own weight. Can't possibly do it. I mean, it's the same with, you know, people try to study idioms, but it's basically hopeless. You can take any phrase in the language and turn it into an idiom if you want. So there are some well-known idioms, like he spilled the beans, means, you know, he gave out the secret. Notice there's only certain ways you could do it. You couldn't say he ate the lettuce. I mean, that's not a possible idiom. But you can take anything you want and turn it into an idiom. You can just take, say, he went to the store, and you can have it mean he just gave up on the task. And if you use it enough, people understand it. Oh, he went to the store, he quit. You know? And you can take that with anything you want. So to try to study possible idioms is to study essentially everything.
Yes.
And there's no way to study everything. You have to try to find parts of everything that you can say something about, then maybe build up to some broader knowledge. Physicists couldn't study the laws of motion by taking videotapes of leaves blowing in the wind. You know, no matter how much data you have, you're not going to find Newton's laws. You know? You have to do very artificial experiments. You have to invent situations which don't even exist in the natural world. In fact, if you look back at the history of science, early history of science, modern science, Galileo, which is what's relevant for what we're talking about, because these are early stages of potential science. What you find is that Galileo never did most of his experiments. We know that because they're physically impossible. And his results were much too good. Same with Mendel. If you look at Mendel's results, it's now understood he never got those results. It's statistically impossible. Even with careful modern experimentation, you couldn't get things that clean. There's too many other variables underneath. And so Galileo himself did thought experiments. Mendel did experiments, but then he cleaned them up so they could be the way they ought to look, you know. Real, you know, you're studying quantum thermodynamics or something, you make extremely artificial experiments because that's the only way to learn anything. You can't learn anything by just looking at what's going on in the outside world. I mean, you can learn something, but it's just too messy, too many variables and so on. So same with language acquisition. You really have to do careful, good experimentation with children to find out. So the question is about the study of language in cognitive science. I would say it's not a relation between two things. Language just is a core part of the cognitive sciences. In fact, if you look at the way the modern cognitive sciences developed since the 50s, starts mainly with the study of language. Jerry Fodor, one of the old friend, late died recently, one of the founders of modern cognitive science, used to quip that cognitive science is a study of language and vision. And those are the two things you really have something to say about. Something about concept formation, but a lot of it is closely interrelated with language. So you study the parts you can study, like anything. You don't study things you can't study. You're too far out. So language, I think, is just part of the cognitive sciences. The things like, as we said, artificial intelligence might be ways. It really is cognitive science if it's done properly. In artificial intelligence, you can regard it either as part of the sciences or as pure engineering. Pure engineering means I'm just trying to get something that works, like the Google Translator, which is fine. As part of science, you see, are there ways to use computer modeling to advance the study of the theoretical sciences? And probably are, yeah. But I don't think there's really anything general to say about it. You work on the problems which are at the fringe of understanding. You have a partial grasp of them, but they're open questions. So take, say, what we were just discussing about language. Very striking fact about the nature of externalization versus the internal system. Some very interesting things that come out. Take a simple sentence like the man who fixed the car carefully packed his tools. Okay, it's ambiguous. It can mean he fixed the car carefully or he carefully packed his tools. Now put carefully in front. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed his tools. It's unambiguous. And it's unambiguous in a curious way. Carefully goes with the more remote verb, not with the closest verb. It means he carefully packed his tools. Doesn't mean he carefully fixed the car. Now that's a little kind of strange, because if you think of the simplest computational procedure of a sequence of words, you have carefully in the front. It's looking for some verb to modify. It doesn't pick the closest one. It picks the farthest one, which is quite strange. If you look more closely, you find that this is true, this property is true for every construction in every language. It's universal, anything you look at, that's what you find. Now, if you look more closely and you think of the structure of that sentence, that the man who fixed the car is a unit, then comes carefully, and then fixed his tools, packed his tools. Carefully is actually structurally closest to packed, more remote from fixed, because that's embedded within a former structure. So if you look at structural distance, you actually are picking the structurally closest thing. But notice that structural distance is something that a child never hears. You don't hear structures. You hear linear sequences. So what it means is the child ignores 100% of what it hears and pays attention to something that it never hears. Okay? And this is true for all constructions in all languages. Well, you're not going to find that by looking at data. No. But you can find it by experiment. And it turns out that infants as young as 30 months old already know this. So it's just part of your nature. And there are good explanations for it. Turns out that the simplest computational operation possible, if you assume that languages work on the basis of the simplest computation, happens to give you this result. Okay, but you can't find that out by looking at data. In fact, it took about 60 years of modern linguistic work even to come to understand this. Now we understand it. But that's how science proceeds, always proceeded that way. And use what you can to help, but what's really going on is up here you know, finding things that are puzzling, try to figure out what the accounting for them, try some things, they don't work, you learn something new, maybe you get a lot of descriptions, and finally, after a lot of work, maybe you can get some answers. But there are real puzzles. As by now it looks as if, for reasons like this, the internal system pays no attention to the way it's externalized. On the other hand, there's a lot of empirical evidence that seems to show the opposite. So you have one of these lovely quandaries that make science interesting. You have a theoretical explanation for fundamental properties which works over a large range. So you have every reason to think they're true. But there's a lot of recalcitrant data around, which seems to disconfirm it. Okay, next challenge. Find out some other way of thinking about the data, which will bring it into conformity with what seems to be fundamentally true. Now that's the kind of question that makes science interesting. If you didn't have questions like that, that's why when the Higgs boson was discovered, a lot of quantum theorists were very disappointed because they thought that something was going to come about that didn't fit existing theories. It did fit existing theories, okay, it kind of confirms them, but kind of disappointing. We thought we were going to get some new challenges. It's pretty much the way science works.
Thank you for that detailed answer, Noam. I think, do we have anything to say upon that?
No.
No?
No.
All right. So,
I can move on to the next question if you're ready.
okay.
We have like a bunch of it. So the next question is about your theory of universal grammar and the perspective of semiotics to your theory, basically. So can the theory of universal grammar be interpreted beyond the boundaries of linguistics and entirely in semiotic terms? What do you think about that?
Well, universal grammar is a phrase that's often misinterpreted, even by professional linguists. There is a long history, century-old history, of study of what's called universal grammar. But what the theorists were looking for were principles that are common to all languages. Now, in the modern period, the last 60 or 70 years, the term universal grammar is used, usually just called UG, to distinguish it from the tradition. But it's used in a somewhat different sense, in a sense that it wasn't contemplated by the long tradition. It's used as the theory of the biological endowment, the genetic endowment for the language faculty, the kind of thing that an infant has, but a chimpanzee doesn't have. That means that if the infant is presented with noises, quickly comes up with a language. If the chimpanzee is presented with noises, it just comes up with noises. Okay, whatever that difference is, that's universal grammar. It's like in the case of vision, what it is that makes us have a mammalian visual system and not an insect visual system. Not experience, just something coded in the genome. That's universal grammar. So, for example, this principle that I just mentioned about looking at structures but not linear order, that's part of universal grammar. Principle that's called structure dependence. The brain is coded in such a way that the infant automatically looks for structures, doesn't pay any attention to order. That's just the way we're built, like growing arms instead of wings. Now, that's universal grammar. It's very hard to find any other kinds of evidence that bear on it. One reason is that universal grammar, the language faculty, seems to be a true species property. All human beings seem identical in this respect. take an infant from a tribe in Papua New Guinea that hasn't had other human contact for 40,000 years and bring the infant up in New York, it'll speak with a New York dialect of English, just like any other kid, and conversely. There doesn't seem to be any difference among humans in this capacity. It seems to have emerged along with humans a couple 100,000 years ago. It's nothing remotely like it is found in other animals. So you can't, if you want to study the kind of experiment that I mentioned on vision, you know, trying things with cats and monkeys and then drawing conclusions about humans, can't do that with language because no other organism has anything like this capacity. So it's something very specific to humans. It's kind of the core of human nature fundamentally. It's the core of human creativity, the arts, complex social structures, our scientific knowledge, our artistic capacities, all seems to be rooted in this strange thing that developed along with humans. It's very interesting to find out what it is. But basically that's universal grammar. It's probably we should have picked a different name because it confuses people. But and now that's why it's usually just called UG, so people don't associate it with the tradition or the idea that it just means what's common to a lot of languages. I should say even professional linguists are very confused about this. No matter how much you try to explain it, it doesn't get through. So you know, people are constantly looking for some exotic thing somewhere and say, okay, that refutes universal grammar.
Yeah, we have watched documentaries about that. It's different ideas in our classes also. But as you said, I think we agree here also because that's why we ask such a question. Because we think universal grammar can be interpreted in any way humanly possible, as long as it relates to natural, innate human ability that can't be hindered and tries to come out if there is no big issue with the brain or no issue with the faculties that are necessary for that. What would you say about this, Hani?
Well, we have to be careful to be true to the technical meaning of the term. I mean, I suppose some literary critic criticizes physics because physics has the notions work and energy, but physicists don't look up employment statistics when they're studying work, and they don't look at how people get tired when they're studying energy. It doesn't mean anything. These words have, they may use the English name, but they have technical meanings, and they have to be studied in terms of their technical meanings. Same with the undecidability that I mentioned before. You can't just, if you want to understand the way the word is used by mathematicians, you have to look at the conditions of use. You can't refer to the way it's used in normal discourse. And the same is true when we talk about universal grammar. Within the context of linguistic research, it has the specific interpretation that's given to it, much like the meaning of energy in physics. That's the meaning that's given to it, not the general meaning. So all we have to do really is keep clear-headed about this, understanding what the technical meanings are, and what the general meaning of the concepts is. And if we do that, there's no reason to get into trouble.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So you gave examples about the child acquisition, infants acquisition, and next question actually is related to that one. So consider in general reference to semiosis and within the scope of Peircean structural classification system for firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and Thomas Sabioc's modeling system when we take them into consideration. As you know, we can relate to, actually, I think that we can relate those concepts to an infant's language acquisition and actually perception of words and signs around us. So, what can be some future milestones in R&D integrating, again, cognitive sciences and artificial intelligence in terms of those concepts?
In terms of Peircean concepts of Charles Sanders Peirce, those kinds of...
Yeah.
Well, Peirce was a great scientist and mathematician. Had some interesting things, a lot to say about logic. Major contributions. What he said about language and semiotics, I don't think really carries us very far. So Peirce accepted a general tradition, which is almost universal today too, which holds that, say, the simple words of language refer to things. So the word dog refers to those animals that happen to be at my feet. And the word river, it refers to that thing that I cross on the way to work. That's what that concept of reference is the core of Peircean semiotics, and in fact, just about the whole field up to contemporary philosophy of language. But there's a problem with it. Language doesn't work that way. I mean, if you look at the way words are used and understood, they don't have reference. So take that river I cross. What makes something a river? Is it the fact that water is flowing through a channel? No, obviously not. So if I take that same river and I put barriers along the side and I start using it for sending ships up and back with freight, it's not a river, it's a canal. If you replace, suppose an industrial plant is constructed upstream and it's polluting the river, it's pouring, say, arsenic into it, and maybe 90% of what's in there is arsenic, a little bit of water, it's still a river. On the other hand, suppose I take the actual river as it actually stands, and I harden the surface some way, which you can do, makes it small. Actually, quantum theoretic change, it makes it hard. I paint a line down the middle and start using it for traffic, commuting. It's not a river anymore, it's a highway, even though the change is minuscule. So what we find if we look further is that huge changes can take place and it's still a river. The tiny changes can take place and it's not a river anymore. What's more, this is universal. Every language that has the word river, it's going to be the same. A child knows all of this stuff, obviously without any experience. Nobody can be taught this. The richest dictionary in the world doesn't even come close to it. Just gives hints. Every word you look at is like this, even the simplest ones. So it simply is not true that the words of a language pick out things in the world. What the words of a language do is give you a kind of a rich perspective for interpreting the way language is used. So the very core of the theory just doesn't work for human language. Actually, I should say this is a very tiny minority opinion. It was actually recognized by Aristotle and a number of other people along the way, but almost the entire history, and today virtually everyone in philosophy of language and linguistics or cognitive science It takes for granted that words refer to things, and they don't. We use words to refer to things, but that's quite different. That action is an action of humans, and the action takes place against a background of understanding, much of which is innate, some of which is added by our history, like, say, an undecidability. But much of, almost the richest part, is just innate, shared among all humans, known by children without any experience. And it's used to refer to things in the world, to carry out that action. But once you see that, we're right in the midst of cognitive science, but reconstructing cognitive science to deal with the way people actually use language and think, which doesn't happen to be the way that theorists throughout the ages have claimed. One of those many cases where the theories that are almost universally accepted simply don't apply to the subject matter. They are very simple and nice, and they work in some artificial cases, but not for language. Actually, notice that those theories do work for the sciences in a sort of normative fashion. So when a scientist is constructing a theory, say a theory of atoms and electrons, the scientist hopes that the concepts he or she is developing will in fact refer to real things. That when we talk about phonemes, let's say, we're hoping that there are real things in the world that we're referring to. So it's a normative regulatory principle for the sciences, but it's not the way language works or the way thinking works. And these are things, I should say, again, it's a very minority opinion, though I'm glad to have Aristotle on my side. But it's not accepted, not understood by philosophers, linguists, cognitive scientists. But if you think about it, I think it's correct. There's some who understand it, not many. It's one of those interesting areas where I think there's a lot of work to be done to get professionals in the field to pay close attention to what's happening. This has happened often before in the history of science. There were things that were just taken for granted, regarded as just, you can't even question them, which turned out to be wrong. To take one of the most famous cases, the greatest scientists maybe ever, Galileo, Newton, others, were committed totally to what was called the mechanical philosophy. The world is a machine. It's just a more complex variant of the intricate artifacts that artisans were making all over Europe. Gears, levers, things pushing each other, and so on. Newton, Leibniz, some of the greatest thinkers in history, totally committed to that. Newton showed that it's not true, that things interact without contact. That's gravity. The apple goes to the ground without any contact between the apple and the ground. And Newton regarded that as a total absurdity that no person with any scientific understanding can accept. He spent the rest of his life trying to find a way around it, of course failed. Scientists tried for a while to find a way about it. And finally, they just gave up. It's enough to have theories that are intelligible, even if the world isn't intelligible. Major change in the history of science. By now, it's not even noticed anymore because everybody's accepted the lowering of standards. But at the time it occurred, it was utterly shocking. Everything that everybody believed, the greatest thinkers, is wrong. How can we handle this? Actually, there are many such moments. So, for example, before Galileo, it was just taken for granted, as every one of us takes for granted, unless we've learned some science, that if you have two balls of lead, one of them's bigger than the other, and you drop them, the one that's bigger will fall faster. everybody assumes that. Every child assumes it. It just doesn't happen to be true. As Galileo showed, it's not true. And he showed it, incidentally, not by experiment. He didn't drop balls off the Tower of Pisa. That wouldn't have worked. He just did it by a thought experiment. Pure thought showed that that can't be true. Okay, we learned what everybody automatically assumed to be true is false. Those are crucial moments in the history of science. I think we're approaching such moments today in the cognitive sciences and semiotics. We're approaching a recognition that what everyone believed is wrong. But take this fact that the variation in language apparently seems to be not in language, but in the way sensory motor systems externalize language. You think what that means for a minute. It means that the whole rich study of language for millennia, back to classical Greece and classical India up to the present, is not about language. It's not about language. It's about the externalization of language, which is not language.
Yes.
It's and the real question of language we're just beginning to study today. It's things like structure dependence. That's real language, but that was never even noticed for millennia. Just like the fact that objects fall at the same rate, no matter what their mass was unbelievable. Couldn't accept that. That happens in the history of science, and I think we're at quite an exciting moment in the cognitive sciences, where this, I think, is about to break through, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yes, today's counterintuitive ideas.
Off to the next interview, I'm afraid. Goes on.
So we have to end early, I think. Not early, but at least some of our questions in our hands. But that's okay.
Yeah.
It was so nice to see you, Noam, and get a chance to talk to you. I hope we keep our correspondence as well.
I hope so.
And I wish you a nice day and take care.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's so nice to meet you.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Have a good day.